Welcome to Volunteer Fairfax's training on inclusive volunteering. The Disability Inclusion and Volunteering Task Force was formed to develop and promote volunteer activities for people with disabilities in Fairfax County and the Northern Virginia region. Disability inclusion is good for the individual as well as for their families and communities. We believe that everyone can serve. Our goal is to provide volunteer experiences that are meaningful and fulfilling and that value the contributions of people with disabilities. Research by the consulting firm Accenture has shown that disability inclusion is good for business. People with disabilities represent an untapped pool of potential volunteers. People with disabilities bring diverse talents and experiences to your organization. When people feel included, they become loyal supporters. And finally, disability should be part of your organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Organizations that host volunteers should have the same goals for all volunteers. Provide a welcoming environment and volunteer activities that advance your mission. All volunteers should receive appropriate training and orientation to their task. Expectations should be clearly communicated with respect to schedule, appropriate attire, and any other requirements. You should provide constructive feedback that enables volunteers to perform their tasks satisfactorily. And if it is apparent that a volunteer with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation in order to perform the task, you should be willing to explore that need. Our volunteer management system, or VMS, offers several options for you to categorize your volunteer opportunity. One of those options is inclusive. The inclusive tag is meant to help volunteers with disabilities find opportunities with organizations that welcome people with disabilities and that understand how to provide a meaningful volunteer experience for someone with a disability. The first step is to invite people with disabilities to apply and to request reasonable accommodation. Provide a specific point of contact for the potential volunteer. Your description of the volunteer opportunity should be specific enough that someone with a disability can decide whether it's a good fit and what accommodation they might need, if any. An inclusive volunteer opportunity will include appropriate training or onboarding and constructive feedback to the volunteer. Here is a sample statement that your volunteer opportunity listing should include. We welcome volunteers of all abilities. If you need a reasonable accommodation to participate in this volunteer opportunity, contact Jane Smith at jsmith@myorganization.com or 703-555-1212. As mentioned, your volunteer opportunity listing should include sufficient information for someone with a disability to determine whether the position is a good fit and what accommodation might be necessary. Pay particular attention to any physical requirements and to the environment in which the task will be performed. Some individuals with disabilities have special considerations for transportation, so be clear about the required schedule and whether there is flexibility around the schedule. Best practices in supervising volunteers apply equally to volunteers with disabilities. Volunteers should receive orientation to your organization and its mission, as well as training or instructions for the task to be performed. You should check in with volunteers regularly to see how things are going and to offer constructive feedback when necessary. A volunteer may need coaching to perform the task more effectively. Accommodation may be necessary to enable a volunteer with a disability to perform the task. If the volunteer is not able to perform the task satisfactorily after receiving feedback, coaching, and exploring reasonable accommodation, consider whether there is another task the volunteer can do successfully. We have mentioned the term reasonable accommodation several times. This term comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It simply means any change to the way things are usually done that enables a person with a disability to have equal opportunity. Generally, the person with the disability is the best source of information about any accommodations they may need. A few examples are listed here. Someone with intellectual disability may need a checklist or chart to remind them of what to do. Someone with a physical disability may need to sit instead of stand, use a raised stool, adjustable table, or other modified workspace. Someone with a developmental disability may bring a support person to help them stay on task. Someone with a visual impairment or reading disability may use special software that reads computer text aloud. Someone who is deaf or has hearing loss may communicate through a sign language interpreter or by texting. Someone with physical or mental health issues may bring a service dog that is trained to do work that assists the person with a disability. An accommodation is not a substantial modification of the task or a lowering of quality standards. Remember that you have recruited volunteers because you have a task that needs to be done. A volunteer with a disability must be able to perform the task, though they may do it in a different way than other volunteers. Finally, a few words about disability etiquette. Remember that people with disabilities are people first. Treat adults with disabilities as adults and do not talk down to them. Speak directly to a person with a disability, not to a companion or aide who may be accompanying them. A person's mobility equipment, such as a wheelchair, scooter, or cane, is part of their personal space. If you are speaking with someone in a chair or scooter, it is helpful to sit and speak to them at eye level. Listen attentively when you are talking with a person who has difficulty speaking. Ask them to repeat or restate if you don't understand, and don't pretend to understand. People who have developmental or psychiatric disabilities may have different ways of coping with their disability. Many disabilities are not visible, including mental health conditions, learning disabilities, and chronic medical conditions such as asthma or diabetes. Volunteer Fairfax has developed a toolkit on inclusive volunteering for organizations that host volunteers. You can find it on our website at volunteerfairfax.org. Thank you for your attention.